Hello, everyone. You're listening to the 805 Uncensored. We are a show on the Anti Capitalist Podcast Network. This podcast covers a variety of topics from music to politics, news, philosophy, and more. There are no limits, which is why we are uncensored. So, welcome. Please follow us on your podcast and social media platforms of choice. This is episode number 103. And today on the show, we've got Josiah, also known as Christian Anarcho-Communism. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So, first things first, would you like to just introduce yourself to our listeners?
Yeah, I go by Church of Christ the Anarchist on Instagram, and I a labor organizer mostly, and that's mostly what I do. On the side, I do a good amount of writing I do fiction from an explicitly anarcho-communist, Christian anarcho-communist point of view.
Awesome. Yeah, so today we're going to be talking about Christo-Fascism, Christian anarchism, Christian principles, left wing politics, and a few other umbrella topics. So, the first thing that I wanted to ask you is, in your view, what are the key principles associated with Christianity?
Ooh, starting off with the easy ones, right? Yeah, this one could easily be a entire season, right?
Yeah.
But I'll stick to just one word
Okay.
at first, and that's I'd say liberation.
Hmm.
That's the recurrent theme through what we call the Bible, the Hebrew scriptures, the Greek scriptures, and traditions following. But I also want to give a bit of an outline, and I'm going to make this also very simple. Um, like the world is fucked up, right? It's unjust. It's ruled by unjust systems. I think we can all agree on that. Um, and I think in the Christian framework, we call that sin and death, or the fall, and that rules the world. And that from a spiritual perspective, that's because we're not reconciled with God. We're not reconciled with the earth. Um, and I, we and God can't just chill with an unjust world, right? And we're roughly in the Easter season in the Christian tradition, which is the defeat of sin and death. And the practice of Christianity is reconciling with God and unfucking the world.
Yeah, we're about 2 weeks out from Easter,
Yeah.
which ironically falls on 420.
Hell yeah. I mean, they have found cannabis on ancient Hebrew altars. I'm just saying.
Yeah, I mean, we could go down a whole rabbit hole with this. I've long felt that I don't even want to associate cannabis with drug use, even though it probably technically is. Um, I would say that a lot of religious teachings have been inspired by people that are under the influence. I just think that the evidence points towards that direction.
Yeah, there's I think there's so much about how we are, and this is I think true in any mode of production. Like, we get stuck in the day in, day out, and the social mores and the habits of a world that is fucked up.
Hmm.
And it takes something, and this is very common. It takes something like a traumatic experience, or a something using a substance to bring us out of that, and then we can have this like mystic revelation, because we're not attached to the um the routines of a fucked up and unjust world. I think
Yeah,
that's, I don't know, that's my theory.
no, me too. And I think what you're correct me if I'm wrong, but I think what you're getting at too is just like trying to make sense of things.
Yeah, yeah. I One of my pet peeves is the word myth.
Hmm.
um and and I'll probably end up talking about Adam and Eve at some point, but I when I say myth, like, what's the first word that you think of? Like, what's your assumption about what a myth is?
Honestly, I think of the Greeks.
Right. But culturally, like, we assume that it's untrue.
Yeah,
Like, how
yeah,
many
like bullshit.
articles, yeah, like, how many articles, like, you like, that's a myth, like 5 myths you've heard about productivity or whatever bullshit. Um so, like, the colloquial use is that it's untrue, but in a mythic sense, it's considered true but not fact.
Mm.
Capital T true. Um, so in the case of Adam and Eve, like we're talking about like symbolism of how a world becomes fucked up.
Hmm.
And the truth of that symbolism is irrespective of whether or not they were real people. Um, and so to me, and and how myth relates to my faith, I think like it doesn't like I don't I'm not hurt if somebody calls it a myth because I'm like, yeah, well, obviously. Like I if and to me, even like the resurrection, something like the resurrection, I don't have to believe in a physical, like a historical resurrection, because to me the meaning of it remains the same regardless of whether or not it happened. um so anyway, yeah, I think the way we talk about myth is it's also really removed from oral tradition, which is um like most of our lives are removed from that. We think in very literal terms because that's how we experience the world. We experience the world through reading mostly. And reading it, like the a text doesn't change unless it's edited, right? But a, if I'm going to go read Don Quixote, that hasn't really changed, and it's going to be the same for the past few hundred years. Whereas oral tradition, the stories change based on how cultures and generations change. Anyway, I can I can
Right,
also
right.
go down a
So
rabbit hole
are
there.
you kind of equating myths then with like a fatalistic sort of thinking where the main point is getting the message out of the story rather than whether or not the story is actually literally true?
I would say there's kind of three categories in folklore. Um, there's myth that happens in a world that's unlike ours, talking snakes and whatnot.
Hmm.
Um, and that tells us that they're they're not generally believed to have happened, but they are believed to be true.
Mm.
Um, which is hard for us, post enlightenment, post industrial minds to
Right, right.
to
To your
conceptualize.
point, people thinking in black and white terms.
Right, right. There's legends. Um, so I'd say like something like Finn McCool and the Fianna or something like that. Small fish that grows into a bigger fish. In the Christian tradition, I'd maybe refer. This is easier for me to say as a Protestant, but I'd say that maybe saints, the
Hmm.
stories of saints would be closer to legends. And then there's folk tales, fairy tales, and the like. So this is also generally believed not to be, in a world like ours, and not believed to be happening. And that's more of a fatalistic, like moral of the story. And Jesus does kind of use a little bit of that in the parables, but I'd also, in the Christian tradition, I'd refer to Jonah as a kind of a fairy tale, like folk tale. The way that it's written is not aligned with the more historic writings, and the way that the whale is used, or the big fish is used, is much more of a literary way that you would tell that story. So it's so that, yeah, I think that myth is easily conflated and kind of minimized to a more fabulistic understanding. But the way that I would say that it's different from like a fairy tale is that in myth, there's a ritual to step inside the myth and partake in it. And that's, I think, there's a difference between just stale ritual, which is like the obligation, and the actual participation in something that actually means something. And I think there's a in the evolution of Christianity in the last few hundred years, especially in America, there's an emphasis on the individual ritual that you do at church. Like you're a Christian, so you just go to church, you sing the songs, you take communion, and that's it. But the other part of the ritual is actually going out and loving your neighbor, right? Feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, taking care of your neighbor. That is also a ritual. It's not ritualistic. It's not. what we associate as a religious ritual, but it is as a way in which we participate in the myth ourselves, and we step inside the myth. Um, so I think that's a main difference between myth and fairy tale or fabulistic stories. Yeah,
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. So I kind of want to shift gears a little bit here.
yeah. That, any one of these could go into a rabbit trail because there's so much there to unpack.
But it is also closely aligned. So I want to look at your definition of anarchism and how do you think anarchism and communism relate to the Christian tradition?
Yeah, in simple terms, I'd also define anarchism as liberation.
Yeah,
Whatever hyphen or color you want to add to the black flag, I think that's what it comes down to.
yeah.
But in a larger definition, I'd put it to stateless, cashless, classless society with communalized resources.
Hmm.
And in the Christian tradition, you see that the most, uh, I'd say, direct example of communalized resources in the book of Acts. There's a description of the early church community where they held all things in common, and this is where the phrase from each according to their ability to each according to their needs um, comes from, right? I'm not there's many leftist theorists that have pointed out the roots of this, but that's where it comes from. So there's a direct correlation from that to those values and the early church. There's also uh, it's really funny because Augustine is a very complicated figure in the Christian tradition. He's loved by conservatives and Christo-Fascists for a lot of weird reasons, but at the same time, he is one of the church fathers that railed against private property.
Mm,
There's five main ones, but it wasn't uncommon. Like this was a thing,
yeah.
right? For especially the first 300 years of Christianity. There's John of Chrysostom. I'm gonna mispronounce his name. Basil the Great. Um, I think Gregory of Nyssa. But there's a lot of folks where they literally are in a bit of archaic language, but they say property is theft. Like to call anything your own is to steal from your neighbor. I don't know how directly property is theft you can get to, right?
Yeah,
um,
pretty close translation there.
right. There's also a the so the Bible is not univocal. Like that, like
Hmm.
that's one of the foundations of Christo-Fascism is that it's univocal and that you can kind of treat it as a rule book, right? But it's not. So there's at various stages and various genres and depending on what the purpose of a book in the Older Testament is, you can find, hey, a ruler has an obligation to be just, or a warning against monarchy in general.
Hmm.
Which is very in Second Samuel when Israel gets their first king, the people of Israel get their first king, there's a warning from the prophet Samuel where he's like, they're going to take your sons, he's going to take your shit, and he's going to do whatever he wants, whether it's just or not, and it's not going to make your lives better. Um, but also, I see Christ's Jesus Christ's life as being anti-imperial. Um, he wasn't he wasn't Roman bourgeoisie. He was an occupied uh, and a, in a part of an oppressed people. And when we go into Good Friday, um, you might hear about him being crucified on the other side of thieves, but that's kind of a mistranslation. What the closer word to that is like a guerrilla. So like a reparee in Ireland that steals from Anglo-Irish landlords, or kind of a Robin Hood figure. Like we're gonna ambush the Romans and steal their shit. And crucifixion was reserved for insurrectionists. So Christ was, even though he didn't necessarily straight up say, "Hey, we're gonna march on Rome," because his theologically, the death and resurrection is an undermining of empire. Um, it's an anti-imperial message, right? There's also a discussion of the kingdom of heaven, or the community of heaven, which is stateless. Like he constantly says, "My kingdom is not of this world." Um, when confronted with cash, he says, "That ain't had nothing to do with me. Like that's Caesar. Caesar has his name on that. That's not me." Um, and there's another verse in Galatians where however you feel about Paul, he's talking about how, like, no, there's nothing to separate us. Like there's no, like, borders don't mean anything, class distinction, like there's we're all the same, right? And there's even a description of the early church where uh they're like, I'm just here. I have no allegiance to any nation. I have, like, there's a description of them as being able to blend in wherever, because there's no national identity. Their identity is like to their neighbor, whoever that might be, regardless of borders. Um, and I think that we can go a long ways in comparing the notes, but that's the Reader's Digest version, um, of those values, and I think
So
that it aligns pretty easily.
yeah, and listening to you, it all seems very clear cut to me. And I don't come from a religious background, but I'm wondering, where does this Christo-fascist outlook even come from? Like, where does this whitewashing of Christianity come from?
Well, I like that you said whitewashing, because it's about power.
Hmm.
Like anytime that, like, I'm not here to convince anybody to be Christian or apologize for any or dismiss any harm that the church or Christianity has done. But I will say that by and large, all of the atrocities that have been committed by the church in God's name have been really to further power. And that starts with Constantine, right? Where he says, "Look, you know, these people are a problem. What if I just kind of put them under my umbrella? Like, what is, like, if you can't beat them, join them. Just make them part of the empire, and that'll do the trick." And like from there on, you see the Christianization of, like, you look at the Northern Crusades, or the Christianization of, um, for lack of a better term, pagan folks in Europe. Um, the any Machiavellian medieval scheme, the plunder, pillage, and abuse of the Americas, the transatlantic slave trade, all of that is in the name of wealth and power. And in there's you look at if you look up rich wealth in the Bible, you're not going to find a lot of good stuff. You're going to find some people saying, "Hey, I've been blessed," or whatever. But largely, if you're looking for a judgment value, it's not going to be good. Jesus says, you can't you can't enter my community if you're rich. If you keep all of my commandments, go sell what you have and give to the poor. My favorite is the book of James, where it starts saying, "Woe to you rich people, weep and wail. Your gold has rusted. Your clothes are eaten by moths. The wages you failed to pay your workers cry out unto God." Like, you know, anything that is done has been really in the name of wealth and power. And I think when I like that you said whitewashing, because it is about that preservation of power.
Hmm.
Um, and it comes down to even to theology. Like, highly recommend the a book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree, um,
Hmm.
which looks at lynching and sees Christ in that lynching tree. But it also examines critically, it examines how white Christians avoid that. And they avoid, and part of that is a shift from a definition of justice to something that happens communally, and largely as a nation, to something that happens just to justice and righteousness being something that is personal. Like, you're not righteous because you're in right relationship with your community. You're righteous because you personally are a good person. And that absolves them from taking part in justice and reckoning with how they benefit from injustice. So uh, there's, I think it's also important to note that in the Spanish translations of the Bible, righteousness is translated as justice, and there's a very good reason for that, because the the original Greek word, and I'm not a Greek scholar, but I know a couple of critical meanings. It's dikaiosune, which is both justice and righteousness. It's a kind of hybrid word, and that means like right there's two parts of it, and this is recurrent throughout the Christian tradition, throughout the Hebrew scriptures, that righteousness is both vertical and horizontal, and without both, you have neither. So the vertical is, we could call that mindfulness, we could call that contemplative, like that being in right relationship with your spirit, um, or if you're more religious, being in right relationship with God, um, and nature. And then there's horizontal, like right relationship with your neighbor, right relationship with your community, right relationship, and that is global, right? Your neighbor is everyone. So when you shift that definition of righteousness and limit it to just like, are you having bad thoughts? Are you stealing? Are you lying? Are you masturbating, or whatever the fuck? Um, like, then that absolves you and that whitewashes you, right? That allows you to take part in systems of injustice, without, and still call yourself or think of yourself as righteous. Um, so that's a huge part of it for sure.
Right, and when I'm listening to you talk about all this, I can't help but think about the Calvinistic, mythology associated with the U.S. and the
Hmm.
Puritans in the
Oh yeah,
Eastern U.S. And how they used their personal beliefs and their views on power and authoritarianism to subjugate the Native Americans towards genocidal policies, both like indirectly and directly.
yeah. And I have, I refer to myself as pan Christian.
Hmm.
I think there's something in almost any tradition that you can grab
But just like
that.
one more thing I wanted to
Oh
add
yeah,
on
yeah, go
that
for it.
too
Yeah, yeah.
is so I've read Indigenous Peoples' History of the U.S. by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, and she has an entire chapter called "The Cult of the Covenant."
Mm.
And is this really what you're talking about? Because this is what I can't stop thinking about when you're articulating this information.
Can you describe the cult of the covenant a little bit more?
Um,
I think I know where you're going at, but I want to make sure we're talking about the same thing.
yeah, I mean, basically, we're just talking about using religiosity and Christianity as a means of power and
Gotcha,
subjugation.
gotcha. Yeah. Um. It. Yeah. It's again. It's about. It's
Like,
going to be
you are
about
with
power,
us
and
or you are
anyone.
against us.
Yeah. So, which is a part of fascism, right? It's one of I. Yeah. Well, we can get into to what fascism looks like, but there's a lot of instances in particular, and I don't know a lot of history of Eastern Christianity, in in Ethiopia, the Coptic Christians and all of those. So I'm going to mostly look at European history, and how in opposition to this divine right of kings, this idea that Christianity should be um, affirmative of earthly power structures. There's you have these movements that are based in theology and based in Christian theology that are like, no, 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 that's not how this works. You have the Franciscans, you have the Hussites, and the pre-Reformation Thomas Munster's Peasant Rebellion, which, I mean, that dude, like, there's a lot of Christian anarchists that are like, I don't know about all this guillotine talk. Thomas Munster would be like, no, every prince needs their head chopped off. Um, and the radical Hussites in was now Czechia, who literally set up a stateless, cashless, classless community, and said, "This is the kingdom of heaven." And you have the diggers in England, um, but but yeah, this use of power has to cherry pick and dismiss larger Christian traditions. That's why there's the slave Bible that edited out the parts that were seen as liberating. Um, and I like that you pointed out that this, if you're not with us, you're against us, because there's what if Christianity is going to be used by someone in power, they have to very narrowly define Christianity, right? So how do you do that? Um, One of the things I think that allowed that to happen in two different ways was in the medieval world, you had the Pope as a geopolitical figure. Now, I don't want to. I wouldn't knock the Pope as a leader of the church, but when you marry the two as a as a geopolitical figure, then that becomes a problem when you start dealing in power and making oppressive choices. And the other would be, in the Protestant tradition, the printing press, because once you have this, you can use it as a uh, kind of rallying point and a definition and a tool for control. So but to do that, you have to narrowly define it. Um, and I think we see a distillation of that process. You can see that throughout the um, the pillage of and the atrocities committed towards the indigenous folks of the Americas, but it's distilled today in what we see as this cherry picked version of the Bible used without context. You'll often see anyone that has a Bible verse on their car, puts a Bible verse just randomly anywhere. That's not like, if you're going to quote, Genesis whatever, Genesis 3:2, that's part of what we were talking about earlier as a mythic part of that's very squarely in the mythic genre of the Bible. There's multiple genres included in the Bible, but that's very squarely in the mythic section, right? So that's not how myth works. But in order to justify and enforce power and oppression, you have to define that as the rule book. Like, this is a book of penal codes,
Yeah.
essentially.
And you
And
see
you
this with the
can
Constitution too, the picking and
exactly,
choosing of that.
exactly. Um, so this you have this penal code that you have to selectively interpret, and once you view it as a penal code, you can enforce it any which way you want.
Right.
Um, and I think that it that elements of that are there in the early days of colonization and occupation of the Americas, but it's I think it's almost in its purest form now. You can see that happen, especially in the last 150 years in the United States. Um, but yeah, it's taking very specific verses and applying that to in the same way as a pope might have use geopolitical power, like if you don't believe the same thing about this verse, then you're out of this community. And defining, well, if you're a Christian, you have to interpret these verses the same way, and if you're not a Christian. So there's that. If you're not with us, you're against us. If
Hmm.
you're not, if you don't believe the same thing about this, then you're against the Bible and you're against God.
Right, right.
which which kind of leads to this pipeline of, okay, someone discovers their spirituality or whatever, they go to church, and then they get formed into this, oh well, shoot, well, I guess if I'm a Christian I have to believe this. No, you don't.
Right, and if you grow up in a religious upbringing and you get ostracized from your community, that's not just like you're being kicked out of a club. That's effectively you don't matter as a person.
Exactly, exactly.
So that's yeah, that's deep the fuck down, and I don't think people actually realize that.
Absolutely. And I've talked with a bunch of people who are, um they still go to a Christo-fascist church, but they're like, yeah, I mean, I'm still a Christian, but I don't believe that. But their spouse might still be involved there. Um, so a lot of Christo-fascist churches do have like a very obligatory, um, homeless breakfast or whatever. So you might, once a month, and it's very limited, so that you might be able to say, oh well, I do that, but I need to, I want to do more. So there's a way to kind of keep people involved with that, but a lot of people are still have a hard time kind of escaping, because like you said, their entire lives are, um wrapped up in this community, which, I think, you can quibble about very specifics of what a cult is, but that is a feature of a cult, regardless of whether there's a unifying, cultic figure. uh it's different from the cults of the 70s, right? Where a cult in the 70s might have like a compound or whatever, and it's much more localized. This is more of a cultural cult, you know what I mean? And so it doesn't have the same characteristics, but I think it still is, it still performs the same function as a cult. If you want, whether you want to quibble over the very specifics of the definition, it's the same function, and one of those is that prison by keeping your entire life, um in this community.
Right, and you could argue that it's even more insidious
Yeah, yeah.
because, it's capitalizing on the need for tribalistic behavior that we have in our biological inclination.
And there's the illusion of freedom, so
Yeah.
it is much more insidious. Like, no, you're not, you have the choice of what you want to wear, but if you don't wear, like, a slogan on your shirt, like, you might be less of a Christian.
Right, so
Yeah,
let's talk about fascism then, because
yeah.
I feel like we're kind of dancing around it, but
Yeah, we're getting there.
yeah, so where does fascism play into this, and how do you define Christo-fascism?
Yeah, I think, I start with the definition of fascism. I always lean towards, Umberto Eco's,
The 14
Ur-fascism.
points.
Yeah, the 14 the 14 points, very appropriately numbered. Um, and I think, I don't think that there's a whole lot of the Venn diagram's a fucking circle. Um, I mean, the main points are, the nationalism. And I think so. I read a, in in doing some research for some of the fiction stories I'm writing. I read, Hitler's Monsters, later last year, and it talks about um, the Volkish religion and the the occult, right? And it's there's a section in there that talks about, like, there's this dance that they had to use because Germany was largely Christian. So they're like, okay, well, we want, well, and it's weird because they talk about, there's a Nazi disdain for Christianity because at the time in Germany, Christianity was still, the perception of Christianity was that it's meek. right? It values meekness and kindness and compassion. And I know that's given the discourse in America right now, it's
Yeah,
very hard to
exactly.
imagine.
With Elon Musk when he's
Yeah,
talking about the downfall of Western civilization is empathy.
right. Or JD Vance trying to misappropriate the order of love as first the people that are around you. And I love that the Pope clapped back and said, "No, you fucking idiot. It means the poor who are nearest to you." Um, but yeah, like so they had to at the same time enlist the German Christians as well as say no, this Volkish religion is where it's at. But in Christo-Fascism, there's no kind of dichotomy of antagonism with Christianity because they've been able to define Christianity according to their their agenda, right? So you don't have that split. It's one and the same. Because they've been able to kind of break off what they want and say this is the totality of it's like it's kind of like if you break a statue and then put together like very specific pieces, you're like, this is the entire statue. No, you idiot, that's you've taken pieces that you can reconstruct in a way that you want. That's not the statue anyway. So that I think that's part of it. The But if we go down the 14 points,
Mhm.
there's the cult of tradition, which I want to distinct make a distinction between Christianity as a tradition, which I love that you brought it up the Calvinists, because there's this one of the points of the Reformation was sola scriptura, which was saying scripture is the highest authority, not the only authority, but the highest authority. And that has kind of been I have a friend who likes to refer to it as solo scriptura, because the way that Christians talk about it now, they talk about it in that penal code type of way. Um, so it's kind of morphed into the solo scriptura. But the larger Christian tradition uses prima scriptura, which is that tradition is the highest authority of Christianity, and what how we define it, right? So it's weird to talk about this in a Christian context, because that look towards tradition and not scripture that is kind of used in that um, controlling way is a move away from fascism in a lot of ways. Not that tradition can't be used as a form of control in tradition in what we like I like to call tradcath, Catholic fascists. But in Protestant circles, it's a move away from fascism. But the cult of tradition in Christo-Fascism is just traditional values. I don't think it's as syncretist as Echo says. But um,
Yeah, and
with
specifically, like, in regards to Western civilization, I think that it's an obsession with the quote unquote nuclear family.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Which there's a there's a funny I more interesting, but Jesus at some point says, "I've come to divide father and brother. I've come to blow up that whole thing." Like you're and it looks like a very it's not like the nuclear family is bad. It's just like stop thinking in that term. Like your community is each other, like however that looks like. We're gonna break this up a little bit. So it's also antithesis and an antithesis or an anathema to Jesus' teachings. But it also comes with a rejection of modernism, right? Um, and that's his second point. And in I grew up in a conservative Christian community, and there's this constant antagonism to modernism and postmodernism specifically, and it's seen as an attack on Christianity when it's really just an attack on conservative Christianity and um, the various alignments with reactionary politics. Um, and which also leads to the third point, which is irrationalism. So you get this, if you're rejecting modernism, you're rejecting a lot of these scientific principles that were discovered by Christians.
Yeah.
Like I like to point out when I'm talking to a young Earth creationist or whatever, that the Big Bang Theory was first postulated by a Belgian priest, and that blows their minds. But but yeah, like if you and it's the same thing with world. I think that young Earth creationism is just Christo-Fascist version of the world ice theory, um, because you have to reject modernity and embrace an alternative scientific theory. And any assertion of empirical fact is an attack on Christianity itself, right? And that leads into the irrationalism that it's his third point. And which and these are all like stepping stones, right? Because that leads to his number 4 point, which is disagreement is treason. And we talked a little bit about this earlier, where if you disagree with a part of the Bible, like there are Christians that are like, you know what, I'm not sure I vibe with Paul that much. He seems kind of like an asshole. Um, and that's like, they're still Christians. Like
Yeah.
there's still like, and those, I've met people like that are doing rad mutual aid. Like, but these tenets of conservative values, homophobia, the assertion of political power, which depends on who's in power, the uh, worship of cops and military, and all of that. Uh, Sorry, I lost my spot here. But yeah, and the disagreement of that is treason. That's a direct parallel. Like, but it's not geopolitical treason necessarily. I mean, it ties into the Christian nationalist bit, but it's more about like, if you disagree with this way that I've interpreted things, then you're not a Christian.
Right. And this goes back to your original argument too, which I think this is all about power.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Um, and or even like, for anyone who is interested in deconstructing the homophobia and queerphobia that it's in Christian circles, I recommend, for more concise, the Queer Theology podcast, Blessed Are the Binary Breakers, but also there's a book called Unclobbered. The verses that are used to justify homophobia and queerphobia are referred to as the clobber passages,
Hmm.
um, and there's a large history of mistranslation to justify to justify bigotry, but there's also like a few specific blessings. Like, it's been said before, and I'll say it again, but the way that we view gender and sexuality now is not going to be discussed in the same terms that it was 2,000 years ago, right? But there are places in the Bible that there's a notorious blessing of eunuchs that were not considered to be in the gender binary, by those communities. They didn't kind of know what to do with them as far as gender goes. And there's a part where in the prophet Isaiah says, yeah, and there's and the dudes are cool and the women are cool, and we don't know what y'all are, but you're cool too, and God blesses you. And then the first Ethiopian Christian in the book of Acts is a eunuch, and that's very literarily, that's a very important point, that the first person that in that community is a place of honor, right? But anyway, so my original point in bringing up that was that if you say like, oh yeah, that verse wasn't talking about what you think it is, that doesn't justify bigotry. It was condemning sexual assault or something like that. Even a different trend, interpretation is seen as treason, and you're not a Christian, right? Um, and then I think points 6, 7, and 8, the um, indi- individual and social frustration, um, and the clear lack. They feel like there's a lack of clear social identity, and the humiliation of ostentatious wealth is unique in the current Christo-Fascism, because like there's this weird, like there's a disdain for the elites, right? Or the coastal, the rich liberal cities. um but also like this uh worship of Musk and Trump, because they want to be that at some point, right? Which is different from, I think, what Echo's describing, um, where he describes, like, I think there's a
Yeah, because this is going
similarity.
down a more like anarcho-capitalistic route.
Right, right. And Echo describes inner fascism, where he's like, okay, we were always we valued our austerity, and our enemies, the English, the Jews, were always seen as ostentatious. And I think there's that rugged, rural, uh, value of, hey, I can fix anything, I can, DIY anything, and it's these liberal office workers that can't do anything, that can't fix their own AC or whatever. And you can kind of see a little bit of that, but I think that's more of a larger socioeconomic issue. There's always going to be that tension between rural and urban, right?
Yeah, and I think really that's a lack of class consciousness and being able
Right.
to understand that, white collar workers on the coast, if they're not making more than $300,000 a year, they're not in a position of managerial experience, they're not in a CEO position. They're getting their paychecks signed. They're workers just like you.
Yeah.
Even though
Yeah.
they're not farmers, they're not working in a factory. They're still proletariat.
Yeah. I had this conversation with a Maoist friend of mine, and I also, like, I'm very much about left unity, so I don't mean I don't want to shit on Maoists, really, but we were talking about where's the cutoff for what is bourgeois, and he's like, we are petit bourgeois, like we're office workers, and I was like, yeah, but I don't have capital. Like, I still need to work. If, like, my definition of working class is, do you need to work for a living or starve?
Right.
Like,
And you live
that's
in me and you both live in one of the most expensive areas in the whole country.
yeah,
So like us, I don't even know what you make, but like I don't come close to $100,000. But even if I did make six figures, I'm still barely getting by in California.
exactly. I mean, I have a side hustle for a reason.
Yeah,
um,
it's crazy. Like,
yeah, so it's there's also this, elitism, right? And I think that this is that lack of class consciousness. Like, I think 7 through 10 really is, in the points of your fascism. The pacifism is trafficking with the enemy is I think closer to the earlier points. But it's about class consciousness, and this idea that I think that this relates to a lot of what people in the Christian community call the prosperity gospel, which is really, really, like, explicitly grifting. Like, this is like televangelist, like, follow, like, it's the self-help mixed with, um God wants you to be wealthy, and God wants you to be successful,
fucking
and
Joel
all
Olstein
these. Yeah,
nonsense.
exactly, Stephen Furtick, all of that, which oddly enough is also vilified within, the more fundamentalist Christian
Yeah.
communities, which are also Christo-fascist, because they don't want they see that as a threat to their control. Like they're not
Mm,
going to say this, but what they say is that's diluting the gospel, because the gospel needs to be Jesus died for your sins, and therefore you need to um, act this certain way and be part of this community. So and interpret the scriptures this way. So there's this weird divide there, but there also is a, like, both of those groups, although antagonistic towards each other, work towards um, fascist goals.
yeah.
Like I haven't seen I as far as I can tell, Osteen tends to stay out of political spotlight because he wants both sides money, but a lot of prosperity gospel folks also support Trump. Um, so yeah, there's this, at the same time, disdain for the elite, but also wanting to be the elite. And I think that comes from different sections of the population. When you have the suburban middle class, frustrated middle class,
Hmm.
um, they want to see a there's that disdain for, they're united in the disdain for degenerate art, um, because the
It,
suburban middle class Christianity wants to see a simple um, propaganda art that they believe in. Like they want to see, um, they reinterpret classic literature as affirmative of Christian values, right?
yeah.
Um,
I actually, it's funny that you mentioned classic literature because I was just going to bring up John Steinbeck
yeah,
and how he talks about temporarily embarrassed millionaires.
exactly. But there's this weird value of, like, high art,
Yeah.
but also a disdain for it. Like,
Mm,
we want excellence, and I think it's this, um, both aversion to art that can't be controlled as propaganda,
yeah.
as well as the racist reaction to um, a lot of art that comes out of the black community. Like, you see, like, the reaction to jazz is the same as it was to hip hop, as it is to almost any, as it was to rock and roll. Like, the white reaction to black art
Yeah.
is the same. So
Yeah.
there's this weird, like, tension. Like, we don't want to be so high art that, you're slapping butter or whatever the fuck, um, because that's degenerate art, and that's too liberal. But we also don't want this um influence of non-white art, which they see as low art. So it's slightly different, because the culture is different from Central Europe in the 30s.
Yeah. It reminds me of, I did an episode about William Randolph Hearst and the jazz era in the 1920s and how all the racism came out of labeling cannabis marijuana.
Hmm.
And it
Hmm.
was all because white women wanted to hang out with black jazz musicians in the South. And white people didn't like that. And it was, the white supremacist classic trope of the need to protect white women.
Yeah, yeah, and at the same time as the second iteration of the KKK.
Yeah, which like
Yeah,
countless stories over and over again of lynchings in this country are about, a white woman whistled at a black man or a white woman said this to a black man, and then you had a lynch mob that ran through the city.
yeah,
And yeah, another episode I did was about the Red Summer of 1919, which, was at the height of the Great Migration from the south to the north, and that was actually most of the lynchings that happened in
hmm,
early American
hmm.
history were in that period. Actually, it preceded what happened during slavery times, and a lot of people don't understand that. And it was just, all about this white supremacist trope.
There's a reaction against um in integration.
Yeah,
Yeah.
integration and black people being able to build wealth for themselves,
Hmm. Hmm.
especially in the case of Tulsa,
Exactly.
in the Greenwood neighborhood. It was called Black Wall Street for a reason because these
Hmm.
people made a name for themselves. They built exponential wealth, and the white community couldn't stand that.
Yeah, again, I can't recommend enough the cross and the lynching tree. I apologize to anybody who can hear my dog barking right now. But it it talks specifically about that age and what white theology was doing at the time versus black expression of theology and seeing Christ. There's imagery in the Bible where they refer to Christ as being hung on a tree, and like you can't get more direct of a translation than that, right? Like or a direct symbolism.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
but yeah, that and then the permanent war and heroism. I want to go to point 12 of Echo. There's definitely a kind of warrior cult in Christianity where like I remember growing up there were songs that I mean you have especially songs taken out of context like the Battle Hymn of the Republic, but that was more, if you look at that from an abolitionist point of view, that's not like that wouldn't be that would be anti-fascist, right?
yeah,
Like that's talking about God coming down and enacting justice. um but if you remove it from that context, it becomes this warrior cult type imagery, and you see that um, imagery in a lot of worship songs, or just I'll just say Christian pop music because I think there's a very different. I personally I love a lot of hymns because there's this mystic theological poetry on one hand, and then on the other hand in some Christian pop songs you have like just reinforcement of propaganda. But anyway, um
I would agree.
in those songs there's a lot of militaristic imagery, um and a lot of, if you go into a Christian bookstore, which is, I'll just, yeah, the Christian propaganda factory, um you'll see a lot of like books for young women or books for young men, which are basically just reinforcement of the nuclear family, traditional gender roles,
Yeah,
bunch of bullshit purity culture. But if you look at the young men's books, it's very much like young men are meant to be warriors, and which feeds into this like culture warrior. Like you're raised to be a culture warrior. You're raised to be a hero, which is very much in line with how Echo describes fascism.
yep.
um, and the selective populism and the newspeak, those are very easy to see. I don't think we need to get too much into
Right,
that.
and people wonder where like toxic masculinity really escalated, and we're talking about it right now.
Yeah, exactly. And I think um, Christians need to be honest about if when Christians kind of deconvert from evangelicalism, from Christo-Fascism, they need to be honest about how that. And I don't think that that's a difficult thing when you want to leave that behind, but it's important to make sure that that happens. Like that's something that we need to pay attention to and make sure that we acknowledge and deconvert from that, because a lot of times when I see people kind of move out of the cult, they might still call themselves Christians regardless of whether they end up, they might become atheists or whatever. But a lot of folks don't deconvert from a lot of the things that they're conditioned in that community.
Yep,
So I've seen a lot of people become atheists after deconverting from evangelicalism, but they're or Christo-Fascism, but they still have the evangelicalism and the judgmentalism,
sure.
right? And when folks deconvert from the cult of Christo-Fascism, they need to make sure to deconvert from all of it, not just the theological beliefs, not just the community, but also these areas that have conditioned us for white supremacy, for patriarchy, for cishet supremacy. Um,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah, so what do you think about the quote from Upton Sinclair? You're probably aware of it. When fascism comes to America, it'll be wrapped in the flag and carrying the cross.
100%. Like that dude was a prophet. Um, it's and that's how you have to sell it. Um,
Yeah, like you see it with Trump in
Yeah.
2020 when he gassed those protesters in DC
Mhm.
so that he could do that photo op holding a Bible.
Upside down.
Yeah, right, upside down. But he did that so that he could do a photo op.
Yeah.
Like literally blatant fascism in the capital of the country just so he could have a fucking photo op. And that's exactly what Sinclair is talking about.
Yeah, and like and it goes back to how they wield power. Like if they and the control being this very selective interpretation of scripture and tradition,
Yeah.
um as a prescription. um but yeah.
Anything else you got before we wrap up the episode?
um I do want to in the I want to point out one more kind of more abstract uh marriage between Christian anarchism and or anarchism and Christianity,
Sure.
from a theological perspective, and this is just kind of my pet um thing that I'm chewing on right now. So I anytime I talk about this, I'm like, okay, well, hang on, I need to talk about this. And it's in the biography of Christ, and there's three moments that I see as very affirmative of anarchism. And the first is the incarnation.
Mm,
um and in Christian theology, there's we talk about God as being all powerful sometimes, depending on which which Christians you talk to, and some say that is problematic. But as far as the incarnation is concerned, I think that's very affirmative of anarchism, because if you are an all powerful being, and there's then that brings into the question the problem of pain, right? If God is all powerful and all good, how can he allow suffering, right?
right.
But in this case, you have someone who is all powerful and can, in just a snap of his fingers or their fingers, just eliminate suffering. But that would be authoritarian, right? Like what does that mean if you do that? If you
Right.
force people? Um, so what they do instead is they disavow power. They shed their power in the favor of solidarity, not in you know, in Rome. Jesus wasn't born in Rome. He was born as an occupied person in an empire.
Palestinian.
Exactly. Um, that is the most like that's a refutation of authoritarian power. The second is the temptation in the wilderness. Um, for those that don't know, before Jesus gets into his preaching career, he goes into the wilderness, meditates for 40 days. It's a whole Lent thing, and he's tempted by Satan three times. The first two are related, but I want to focus on the third, where he takes Jesus up to and I don't have any problem gendering Satan as male, but he takes Jesus to a mountaintop and shows him the kingdoms of the world, and he says, "All of these can be yours. You can institute the kingdom of heaven. You can institute your community through geopolitical power. Like this could be really easy." And Jesus tells him, I might be fudging the translation a little here, fuck yourself. Um, and he refuses geopolitical power, which I see as the most direct theological confrontation to Christo-Fascism in the Bible. Um, and then the third is the resurrection, which again, me personally, don't care if it happened or not. The point is the same, and the point is this: that in Christian theology, what happens in Adam and with Adam and Eve is that sin and death entered the world. Capital D death, capital S sin. And what happens when Jesus defeats death is, and there's a great way that the Eastern Orthodox folks talk about this, that he goes into hell or whatever the hell you want to call it, and death is this dragon, and he's like, by law, I get to eat all who come here. And Satan's like, no, dude, you don't want to eat that one that's a spicy meatball. You don't want that one. And death is like, fuck you. This is my right. and he eats Jesus, and Jesus, because he's Jesus, or their Jesus, rips death open from the inside, which is, I think, a nice way a metaphor for describing atonement. But um, the way I think about it is that if death is defeated, then however you want to, there's a lot of ways that you can say how that functions, but let's just say that if death is defeated, and death is the chief of all fears, then all fears underneath that are also defeated. Fear of lack of status, fear of vulnerability, fear of serving, fear of having to lay down your ego, fear of um, lack of safety, fear of lack of wealth. All of those fears removed, allows us to love each other in perfect mutual aid, and B, undermines all empires. Capital E, empire. Because how does an empire rule? Empires rule through fear of death. However you want to, like, it's either direct with something like crucifixion or beheading or whatever, or it's indirect, like
Working
you
to
don't,
survive.
yeah, you don't have healthcare unless you participate in empire, right? Um, or you're homeless unless you participate in capital, or further capitalist interests.
Yeah, some sort of hierarchical pretext.
Right, right. So if death is defeated, then all of that is defeated, and we are free to, without fear of death, without fear of what we lose by not participating in the American dream, be in community with each other, because that's what we have to give up to be in radical mutual aid, right?
Yeah,
Anyway, so that's my 3-point marriage of Christianity and anarchism and
beautifully
theology.
said. I love it. So, where can people find you online? Do you have any projects or anything you'd like to promote on the podcast to our listeners?
Yeah, you can find me on Instagram at Church of Christ the Anarchist. That's underscores in between those words. And also at pulp_podcast, because that is where I read my fiction stories. I have a radio show. We have space pirates, dinosaur riding cowboys, hard boiled murder mysteries, our Indiana Jones and Indiana Jane, which may or may not punch Nazis. Um, yeah, I do two short stories per episode. They range from fantasy, sci-fi, uh, all that stuff. I like the way I go about it is I like starting with what I want to say, and I figure out the genre as a use of the metaphor. So if sci-fi works as a genre, hey, that works. I've got a story about folks that, like, in a society where we've eliminated prison, and you just reduce your life expectancy, because that's what prison is, right?
Yeah.
Like, you just take it's time. It's a reduction of time. And I have another one that is a cowboy riding dinosaur, a sorcerer that, I'm just saying, it's a terrible thing when a hateful ideology possesses someone you love. But that's the point, and then I use the genre of cosmic horror for the metaphor. So that's how I approach it. It's a lot of fun. It's a little goofy. It'll make you laugh. It'll make you cry. It'll make you angry. It'll make you feel exhilarated. All of the things.
Awesome. Thank you for that. I'll be sure to put that in the links.
All right.
As always,
That's
the
cap.
8 of sorry, go
That's
ahead.
capital PULP pulp.
Yeah, pulp. As always, the 805 Uncensored is on all the major social media and podcast platforms. If you have any comments, questions, guest suggestions, message us on Instagram at 805 Uncensored Pod or email us at 805uncensored@gmail.com. Thanks, everybody. Have a good night, morning, evening, wherever you're listening in the world. Free Palestine. The revolution is you. See ya.